This Guy's Garage. Like and subscribe.
Pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and the motion adopted on October 22nd, 2024, the committee resumes its study of electoral interference and criminal activities in Canada from agents of the Government of India. I'd like to now welcome our witnesses for the first hour. As an individual, Mr. Ward, PD Alcock, and from the Sikh Federation of Canada, Prabjot Singh, Legal Counsel. I will now open the floor to questions.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Singh, you had mentioned, and it's been reported elsewhere, that Indian foreign interference networks in Canada have operated for years and were left undeterred as a result of a political choice made by the government not to disrupt those networks. Is it correct that the government had information about these networks as early as 2016? And why did this government choose not to disrupt the activities of these networks?
Like I had said earlier, this is an institutional problem of successive governments for the past 4 decades. There's been public reporting on this issue since as early as the 1980s about Indian operatives intimidating community members here in Canada, interfering in media reporting as well as elections over the past 40 years.
Sorry, I'll just admit, my time is tight, and I want to give you the time, but I want to get through a few points. So, in the last 9 years, and I understand there's a history here that goes back decades, but specifically that were networks, from what I understand, that were identified by CSIS in 2016. And in 2017, there was a proposal brought to disrupt these networks. And according to reporting we've heard from Sam Cooper, the government chose not to disrupt these networks. Is that correct? Is that consistent with your?
That is correct. When CSIS wanted to dismantle these networks, based on that public reporting about the NZCOP's actual contents, is that the government chose not to actually engage in that action because it would disrupt their export and trade priorities with India, and also potentially jeopardize the Prime Minister's trip to India. And right. I think that gets to the root issue that successive governments have failed to take action against India. I would say one is because looking at a marginalized, visible minority that isn't seen to be, true Canadians, and their interests may not be the interests of the establishment or the state or that political party, but it's also this priority to foreign policy over the domestic harms, and that's something we've seen consistently, and that's been reported by NZCOP as well.
And I appreciate your point about the history. There's also a present that you're describing, though, which is that the government of the day, Liberal government, made a choice, and you've confirmed that choice. They made that choice in 2016 and 2017, and that choice contributed to the continuing ability of these networks to operate. But something changed. And I know there's an institutional history, but something changed significantly when the Prime Minister made a choice about not disrupting these networks so that the public image effects of what he hoped for from the trip to India would be there. And then as part of that trip, he signed an intelligence sharing agreement with India. And I think you'd agree that the Prime Minister, knowing about these information networks, these interference networks in Canada, choosing to sign that intelligence agreement in spite of what he knew, that changed the dynamic, because that meant a kind of sharing of information between Canadian intelligence and Indian intelligence that didn't exist before. Could you share with us what was your advice to the government at the time about that kind of intelligence sharing system, and what have you seen since have been the effects of that decision by the government?
So the community has been unequivocal since as far back as the 80s that any kind of intelligence and information cooperation or agreements with India are incredibly dangerous and have led to the loss of life potentially in the past, and is continuing to do harm in Punjab and in Canada today. So even in 2018, when that agreement, that cooperation framework was signed, the community was unequivocal and was very resolute that this agreement should not have been signed in the first place, and it should be suspended immediately, particularly given the revelations.
Why then did the Liberals choose to sign it, in your view?
So if you look at particularly that 2018 report by NZCOP, it's heavily redacted, but when you read between the lines, India was significantly pressuring the government of Canada around these security cooperation issues and amplifying this narrative of Sikh extremism. When you read that report, officials from the government and including from the public service are described as having a strong priority to convince India that Canada is taking their concerns seriously and took a number of steps, including signing that agreement. What I would suggest is to appease India and further foreign policy priorities.
Let me get one more question in. I asked an order paper question to the government if any intelligence sharing between Canada and India contained information about Mr. Najjar. The government refused to answer that question either way. And I was surprised by that. If the answer was no, they could have said no, but they refused to answer the question. What's your reaction to the failure of the government to answer a question about whether intelligence was shared with respect to Mr. Najjar?
It's incredibly concerning, and there needs to be immediate transparency and immediate action to put an end to that agreement and any kind of cooperation that targets political dissidents in Punjab and in Canada. And we have seen evidence of harm coming to individuals in Canada and in Punjab on both sides of these interactions that puts members of the community in harm's way and harms their well-being.
You made some comments in your opening statement regarding foreign interference, particularly interference in the Conservative leadership race. Do you believe there was Indian interference in the Conservative leadership race?
So I think it's important to note and understand, based on Canadian intelligence's own observations, that India's foreign interference is pervasive at all levels of government and in all parties. Just finishing off that last point, in that 2019 annual report where you're talking about electoral interference, the reporting is that when CSIS wanted to dismantle that intelligence network, the government of Canada actually told CSIS to stand down and not take that action that it wanted to take to dismantle the intelligence network, because it was going to disrupt Canada's intention to export pulses, but also that it would have created complications and potentially kiboshed the Prime Minister's trip to India. So that was a conscious decision that was taken at that time. With regards to foreign interference in the Conservative leadership race, we saw in the NZCOP report in June of this year, I believe it's paragraph 73, that talks about intelligence reporting interference in the Conservative Party's leadership race. And if you go into the exhibits at the Foreign Interference Commission, there's an intelligence assessment by CSIS. I believe it's in October of 2022, that's heavily redacted, that talks about foreign interference by India in the leadership of a political party, which coincides with the Conservative Party's leadership race at that time. Sam Cooper, again, who engaged in media reporting around this time, talks about getting exclusive access to an unredacted copy that goes into detail that India targeted the leadership race of the Conservative Party at that time, particularly by excluding a leadership candidate from the Conservative Party from attending any events that are being held by the Indian diaspora.
The Prime Minister admitted that for a number of years that they have known about foreign interference from India, and yet they failed to take action. They failed, frankly, to protect Canadians from that foreign interference. One thing I want to start off asking about is that we have seen a significant amount of misinformation coming from India. We saw a lot of this during the farmers' protest that happened a couple of years ago. We saw this again, maybe most recently, with some of the unfortunate instances that we saw in Brampton. Have you tracked or seen this information? And what have you seen the government's response, the Canadian government's response on this disinformation coming from India?
So I think on that disinformation issue and foreign interference more broadly, as I outlined, that this is an institutional issue that's plagued successive governments for the last 40 years. There's been evidence on the record in public media reporting and other government documents that India has been engaging in foreign interference and that there has been some degree of awareness of those activities in this country. As you pointed out, the question of disinformation is particularly dangerous, not only because India's disinformation kind of bolsters racist stereotypes about Sikhs, and trying to paint the entire community as extremists and terrorists. But it is also targeting Canadian institutions all across the board. And Weldon Epp, who's the ADM for Indo-Pacific, has noted that India has a massive potential to engage in this kind of disinformation activity. When you talked about the the farmers' protest in particular, during that period, the rapid response mechanism that's housed in global affairs had started operating around that time, and it noted that India was engaging in significant activity that was targeting Canadian officials, government officials, and the Sikh community in particular. And I think one issue, in addition to this narrative of Sikhs are extremists or terrorists, there is a concerted effort by Indian actors to paint a political difference around issues of political rights in Punjab as a sectarian conflict. So the RRM did actually observe in 2021 that pro-BJP outlets were trying to manufacture and amplify a narrative of tension between the Hindu and Sikh community in the country, and that there was some degree of insecurity. Earlier this year, in March 2024, CSIS has actually provided a high-level security briefing where they talk about the fact that India engages in foreign interference, particularly with its Hindu nationalist agenda kind of at the forefront. And one of their objectives is to actually target and marginalize Sikhs from political life in Canada altogether. So the impacts of this foreign disinformation and this kind of interference is not only in terms of electoral interference, but it has corrosive impacts on social cohesion by trying to paint sectarian conflict in Canada where it doesn't actually exist. In terms of the government's capacity, in terms of that rapid response mechanism, one of the most shocking things is that in 2021, by the RRM's own account, its analysts and its employees and those involved in that project didn't actually have familiarity with non-Western media ecosystems like India, and it noted particularly that this makes Canada vulnerable to Indian disinformation and the amplification of those kinds of messages. So there's a lack of familiarity. There was an acknowledgement that that was the case. The mechanisms or methodology particularly concentrated on mainstream messages or political leaders, not actually trying to differentiate how is Indian disinformation targeting the community or acting in Canada particularly. So there's a methodology that's clearly ineffective. There's a lack of familiarity. And to my understanding, as of the spring of this year, there's nobody within the rapid response mechanism that even speaks Punjabi or Hindi, which is the language of choice of Indian disinformation. And even broader than that, even within civil society, the Media Ecosystem Observatory, which is an academic resource to monitor disinformation, also doesn't have those resources. So we're looking at a country with a juggernaut of a media apparatus and social media capacities that is specifically and aggressively targeting Canada, and it doesn't look like Canada really has any mechanisms or capacity to monitor, understand, analyze, and actually counter that disinformation.
Thank you for that. I just want to get back into something that you had said that about the redaction of documents that clearly took out any notable incidents of Indian foreign interference out of those documents. Can you elaborate a little bit more about why you think that was the case, of why that happened? And obviously that that alone would have at that time helped to protect Canadians further, but that was taken out, and no action was taken because of it.
I think from the community's perspective, it's particularly shocking because, as I said at the outset, it's not only that the gravity of the threat was hidden consciously from the community and from the public, it was the existence of this threat and how it operates in the first place. So we've talked about how foreign interference by India has been happening for decades. In 2018, after the Prime Minister's trip to India, NZCOP actually published a special report that was meant to look into allegations of disinformation, particularly by David Jean at that time, who was the National Security and Intelligence Advisor. That report was meant to be a transparent mechanism to talk about and deal with the national security and intelligence issues. In 2018, that report talks about Indian intelligence targeting Canadian officials with disinformation to pressure the government to take law enforcement and security actions against Sikh activists in this country. based off of that disinformation. That report is significantly redacted and doesn't actually divulge very much detail about the nature of that disinformation campaign, and it doesn't appear that there was any assessment into the potential efficacy of that disinformation campaign to manipulate or pressure Canadian security and intelligence agencies. And from the community's perspective, there has been a significant unwarranted activity on that front that we have felt. The more concerning part in 2019, after that, the NZCOP's annual report was all about foreign interference and also Canada's capacity to combat foreign interference. So in that report, there are case studies dealing with Russia and China. And when you're talking about redactions, in those cases, there's redactions and there's a summary of 2 to 3 sentences describing what's the nature of the information that was redacted. So there's a case study of Russian foreign interference, Chinese foreign interference, and then there's a second section that talks about Canadian operations to counter that foreign interference. Throughout that entire report, there's 1/3 section that's completely redacted, and all it says is another country that's targeting foreign interference, Canada for foreign interference. Based off of media reporting from Sam Cooper, I believe in September of last year, who reported on getting access to an unredacted copy, actually outlines that in 2016 and 2017, CSIS had actually been observing an Indian intelligence network that was operating and proliferating itself in Ottawa and in Vancouver with intelligence operatives and developing assets in those areas who are engaging in intimidation.
So thank you, Mr. Singh. We're actually over time. Perhaps another member perhaps the next member can give you time to finish that answer. It's Mr. Chahal.
Do you recall any previous party leaders in your years from 94 to 2004 that were offered security clearance and they ever refused to take security clearance?
Mr. Chairman, no, I don't. It's never really come up before, frankly. Nor is there, in my memory, ever been a suggestion that party leaders should have a clearance. This, I think, is generated by the events of the last year or so.
So you've never heard anybody deny it if they've ever been offered to see the security clearance, or any other, not even just a party leader, but any other person of significance that has been offered this for information sharing purposes to protect the country, for the safety or security of the country?
In most cases, Mr. Chairman, that offer wouldn't have been made to anybody else. Party leaders have on occasion in the past been briefed, usually not at a highly classified level, but being briefed on both security and defense issues. But it's never happened in my experience that party leaders. There's never been a suggestion that party leaders should have a clearance. This is, I think, generated by the events of the last year.
And in that regard, there was a suggestion made by the Conservative Party leader that the Prime Minister could just walk over in the chambers to the other side and whisper names of people that might be subject to breaches of security or controlled or infiltrated or influenced by foreign countries. Have you ever heard before top secret evidence being shared in a manner where you walk over and use the protection of the Parliament from prosecution as a tool to pass over information?
Mr. Chairman, no, I haven't, and it would be an odd way, frankly, to do things. The reality is, even if the Prime Minister were to walk across the floor and provide the names of individuals, I'm not sure what the leader of the opposition would be able to do with it, since he would have no evidence to support the listing of the names. So it's really kind of a silly way to try and achieve anything.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Now, for almost a decade now, this government's kind of soft on crime approach, loose border policies has contributed to the fact that organized crime elements in Canada have increased. We've seen highest levels of violence in this country that we've seen, that we've ever seen. Extortion, shootings, arsons. Mr. Alcock, would you agree that criminal environment here in Canada, with much easier to get bail now, lesser sentences in Canada, that it would contribute or maybe create a pathway, make it easier for Indian agents to use criminal activity to carry out that work here?
No, not particularly, Mr. Chairman. I don't think those things are related. I think the Indian interference, I think as the previous witness said, a lot of what we see now in terms of Indian interference is a product of the current Modi government and its ultra-Hindu nationalism. That I think has driven much of what has come to light in the last year or so.
Thank you very much. Mr. Elcock, just wanted to address something. It is true that the CSIS Act allows the government to offer information to any Canadian-specific risks on foreign interference without forcing them to get into a sworn secrecy or controlling what they say. That information can be provided to any Canadian if necessary, if there is risk to Canadians?
Mr. Chairman, the issue of classified information always arises, but to the extent that the service can provide some information to individuals, that has happened in the past, including, I assume, recently.
That information can be provided, and which also includes
the issue of classified information does arise, and there is a limit to what can be provided.
No, you still have 3 minutes, actually.
Done.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Ripple. Ms. O'Connell for 5 minutes.
Yeah, you want?
Thank you, Chair.
If it's okay with Ms. O'Connell, we
fine.
can pass on the
Let's
time
see
to
what they got.
Mr. Motz.
Thank you very much, Chair. Just briefly to both witnesses, thank you for being here. It was already mentioned, Mr. Alcock, that you had talked about Indian interference is not a new issue, that it's become more pressing concern as of late, as a number of countries have become more aggressive in recent years. As a government, as a country, are we properly positioned with our national security framework to address the emerging aggressive threats of foreign interference in this country? And please, both of you answer. And what do we need to prioritize if we're not?
Mr. Chairman, I think that I can't speak to the level of intelligence that the service has at this point because I obviously don't see that intelligence. So I can't really comment on whether the service has enough coverage to be able to respond to foreign interference. My guess, however, would be that one challenge will be resources. Foreign interference is a consuming task. Terrorism has not gone away, and espionage has increased substantially in the last few years as a number of countries become even more aggressive in terms of conducting intelligence operations in various countries, including Canada. So the challenges of resources are always there. There is a question, too, of whether, to some extent, in a world of review, the service has become more risk-averse in terms of what actions it might take. I can't speak to that. My assumption is that they're doing their job and doing it as well as they can, but they do it within a framework that may not entirely always assist them, and that takes you back again to resources. But having said that, Mr. Chairman, I think certainly the authority that the service has and its ability to operate, those exist. It's really a question of you've got the resources to do it. Years ago, somebody asked me whether, as an intelligence service, we had enough resources. The truth is that no intelligence service ever has enough resources. If you were the old East German Stasi, you had half the country watching the other half of the country, and that probably wasn't enough for the Stasi. That isn't true in Canada, obviously. The resources that the service has are much less than the old East German Stasi would have had. But I'm sure that resources are a challenge in dealing with these issues. Foreign interference is a complicated and difficult area to work in, and as both of us have said, the Indians and the Chinese have been much more aggressive in the last few years, so it's more demanding.
Thank you, Mr. Motz. We'll move on
Do
to
I have
Ms.
time to answer the question as well? Is it put to both of us?
Sure. Yeah.
So I'll be quick. I think the response and the concern, I would say and strongly suggest, is that foreign interference is not a security problem per se, and the institutional vulnerabilities and gaps that Canada has is actually a policy issue, and it's primarily that global affairs and the foreign affairs ministry have almost all of the tools to actually combat foreign interference. And so what that leads to is this kind of lopsided approach where foreign policy priorities are consistently prioritized over the actual security and domestic and charter-related concerns and vulnerabilities and attacks that Canadians are facing. So as long as foreign policy priorities dictate, or other partisan interests dictate the response to foreign interference, we're not going to be able to actually respond effectively.
Great. Thank you, Ms. O'Connell, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to both of our witnesses for being here. Mr. Singh, I'm going to start with you, if you don't mind. I'm just curious, as a lawyer, as a representative of the Sikh Federation, how does it feel watching your Canadian Parliament, and in particular the official opposition leader, time after time asking questions about a car being stolen, someone receiving bail or parole, things about crime. We heard it here today, our borders, but not a single question about a Sikh member of our community, your community, being murdered. When the RCMP actually came out in quite an extraordinary way, outlining very serious criminal allegations and an investigation that's still ongoing. And they mentioned homicides. Not a single question, lots of questions about cars being stolen, but not a single question about a Canadian community member and member of the Sikh faith being murdered.
And so what I would say to that is, as I just answered, is the response to foreign interference, as long as it is dictated or driven by foreign policy interests or partisan interests, communities like ours will continue to be marginalized and vulnerable and targeted. Foreign interference obviously is not a partisan issue, and on this issue particularly, we lost a loved member of our community who was a father, who was a brother, who was a friend, who was a leader. And I would suggest, and what I would like to emphasize on all sides across the aisle, anybody trying to turn any element of this issue into a partisan issue is incredibly problematic. And it continues to proliferate this feeling amongst the community that we're being used as bargaining chips by political parties domestically and internationally, kind of in terms of geopolitics, that we're being used kind of back and forth between Canada and India. Our political aspirations, our safety, security, our dignity are primary, and that should be the primary focus of everybody around the table, rather than trying to take partisan cheap shots against each other on both sides.
Thank you. And following up on Mr. Singh's comments about kind of naming, and I want to ask Mr. Alcock this question. The questions around foreign interference, as both witnesses have said, have long existed. And I'm curious about, perhaps, Mr. Alcock, you can speak to the challenge around, and Mr. Singh raised it in his opening statement too, around the naming of, information, or naming and shaming is what some countries do when it comes to some of these activities. And what is that process like, or in your experience? Obviously, you may not have access to the intelligence currently, but that debate around naming of countries and what goes into that process and what are some of the risks?
Mr. Chairman, the issue of actions that are taken to deal with foreign interference, there are a range of actions that can be taken. Some of them are within the control of the service. Some of them are within the control of the police, depending on the nature of foreign interference actions. To some extent, as the previous witness said, as my companion said, There are sometimes decisions taken on the issues of foreign policy, and those decisions are decisions that the government is responsible for and is accountable for. I can't speak to whatever decisions were taken in more recent times, obviously, but generally speaking, in the past, where action has needed to be taken, there has not been a serious issue.
And in that process, one would assume that based on intelligence, that process is constantly reviewed. And there would be thresholds in terms of at what point, for example, is there a risk to not informing Canadians? And I point to, again, the RCMP's announcement and press conference. I can't imagine that a policy is taken and it doesn't matter what country X does, that it's then never reviewed, and that there is an ongoing process based on intelligence gathering.
I assume there certainly would have been in the past, and I assume that would be true at this point in time. I would make the point that, frankly, although I have seen foreign interference over the years, certainly the last year has been a bit of a challenge in the sense that I have never seen anybody attempt to, any other country, attempt to assassinate Canadians in the past. So we have reached somewhat of a new level in terms of foreign interference when that happens.